Hey everyone, I wanted to follow up with last week, which is week 10, and do a little bit of grammatical work, grammatical analysis on James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. So we didn't get to it in class, and you had an assignment. Let's look at it here, class assignment 10, where you were starting to do some of that work. I think it was in, excuse me, lesson 9. You had done some grammatical work. And so I wanted to kind of put some of this there in video. So I'm going to see how this goes. I'm going to try to share my screen with you and put this passage up here. We'll see how this goes. If I can move some stuff around here and try right on the board, hopefully you'll be able to see all of this. But here's your passage, James chapter 1. Verses 2 through 4, which says, "Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." So I recognize that you guys might be looking at a different passage, a different translation of this passage, but in the notes I gave you, the ESV. So just wanted to kind of start with just some of the grammar, just the basic idea of grammar, and just kind of working through this. And I'll do some of this here on the screen. Hopefully you'll be able to see it okay. And then in the coming weeks, we can kind of unpack some of that, and I'll do a little bit of that today. But obviously, anytime you come to a passage, you want to put it in its context. And the context, whoops, already made a mistake. Our context, all we have prior to this is James chapter 1, verse 1. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today, because James 1:1 introduces James to his audience. We'll talk about that in the historical background work that you're doing for this week. And so when I come to a passage like this is obviously 2 through 4. Because I've done this for a while, you begin to start thinking grammatically about the passage. You begin to just kind of see the passage in a particular way. You just kind of begin to read it grammatically. But what I want to do today is to kind of say, okay, for those of you maybe who've never really thought about the grammar of a passage and how you work through it, just even in our English text, trying to get a sense of what it's all about. So I'm going to come in here and we're going to identify all the different parts of speech, like we talked about there a couple of weeks ago. And I'm not saying that you would do this every time you come to a passage, because honestly, it would be kind of weird to do that every time you come to a passage. But for those of you who maybe are just turning to be, kind of begin taking steps towards thinking about things grammatically, how would you do this? And so remember the 8 parts of speech. You got nouns and pronouns, you got verbs, adverbs, adjectives, conjunctions, prepositions, and injunctions. So in this passage, you go, okay, well, maybe you're thinking I haven't spent a lot of time thinking grammatically. So what are some of the more obvious things? So I'm going to start by identifying the verbs, because that might be an easy way for you to think. So right here off the bat, count. You go, okay, that's a verb. Count it all joy, my brothers and sisters, when you meet. Okay, that's a verb. When you meet trials of various kinds, for you know, okay, know is a verb, that the testing of your faith, it produces, there's a verb, produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect. Okay, so that's an interesting one, kind of an interesting construction. So you go, have, what happened here? Have is a verb, and actually let have, I'm going to kind of put it like that helping verb that goes with this, let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be. Okay, so same thing here. You got be as a being verb, and may be, I won't draw the line over there just so I don't mess up the screen that much, but you get the idea. May be is a verb, perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. This one here, you might think of it as, you might look at it and say, well, that's a verb. But that ing there, we'll talk about that in the Greek text. It's actually what it's called a participle. If you remember back to the notes, participles are verbal. They have that sense of verb, but in one sense, they in English you might say it's a verb, but I'm kind of doing a little bit of cheat work here and saying, well, it's actually a participle, which is kind of modifying that sense. So we won't put that one there, modifying that main verb. So there's your verbs. Okay. Pause just for a second for you to kind of think about all of that. But hopefully you look at that and you go, okay, well, I have a pretty general sense that those are our verbs. And then what would be the next thing? And I would suggest that you would say, well, nouns. Nouns are usually fairly obvious. So count it all joy. Put these in green. There's a noun. My brothers, sisters, living back in a very patriarchal time, a lot of times they would just address the men, but it's not meant to be exclusive. So brothers, sisters. When you meet trials is a thing, right? Nouns are person, place, or thing. When you meet trials of various kinds. Now, kinds here is kind of a different one, but it seems to be referring to the different kinds of trials. So we're going to call that a noun. A thing is another word for trials. For you know that the testing, again, depending on how it's used, you might look at that and see the ing there and think, oh, that's a noun. But when it's got that adjective the in front of it, it's referring to a particular kind. So it's the testing. So it's a thing, person, place, or thing. That the testing of your faith being a noun, produces steadfastness. Steadfastness here is also being referred to as a thing. So it's a noun. So let steadfastness have its full effect. Effect, again, here is a noun. By the way, just a little English reminder, when you have the E effect, it's a noun. So it's a thing. It's like the result of the affect, affect, which is a verb. So when you see that E, the effect, you're looking at a noun, the effect that it has, the impact that it has had. Let it have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. And nothing here, I do believe, also is a noun. Okay? So put them up here in the corner, noun in green. Go back over here. Make sure we remind ourselves blue is verbs. And then from there, I'm not going to take forever to do this, because if we did it, it'll take us just forever and ever and ever to get through all of this. But at that point, then what you do is you come in and you start looking at all the different things around it. Okay. Maybe some of you would say, well, I can pretty clearly point out my conjunctions and count it all joy, my brothers and sisters. Right. That's a conjunction. When you meet trials of various kinds, and you want to come here and just kind of go, these ands, I know these are all conjunctions, pointing things together. But let's just kind of go through these, okay? So count it. It, pronoun. Count it all joy. Okay, well, what's all doing there? It's referring to joy. And somehow or another, I just erased that. What did I do? Sorry, guys, learning how to do this here on this. So let's bring that back. That's a noun. And so this is all joy. So it's referring to the kind of joy, all joy. So that would make it an adjective. My brothers. So it's a pronoun, right? Referring to possessive, my brothers and sisters. We've already talked about. And then when you meet. So it's it's when do you count? So when is actually what we would call here an adverb. And it's pointing you back to this particular, why is that not doing that? Pointing you back to this particular verb. Count it all joy, or consider it all joy when. So it's an adverb modifying that verb, which is significant to kind of understand how this passage works. We'll come back to that. When you, obviously you being a pronoun, meet trials of, that of is what we call preposition, right? Showing relationship. When you meet trials of various kinds. Well, if this is a noun, then various is going to be an adjective. It's referring to the various kinds. And then now you have here for. This is a conjunction. It's giving you some basis for what he's just talked about here. Again, you being a pronoun, for you know, that is a conjunction, giving you the content of what it is you know, the testing. So these are interesting because a lot of times we'll think of a definite article as another thing, but a definite article or an indefinite article in English are always adjectives, right? Because they're not standing there by themselves as a separate, they're the testing, the particular kind of testing he's talking about here. So that's an adjective. Once again, here, preposition showing relationship. What kind of faith? It's your faith. So it's pronoun. It's referring to a particular group of people, the brothers and sisters. So possessive pronoun, your faith produces steadfastness. And let have, that's the verb, steadfastness have its full effect. It's being a pronoun. Effect, what kind of effect? Full effect. So that's an adjective. Modifying that noun effect. That, just like we've seen already, that you may be, so that is a conjunction. That you, pronoun, may be perfect and complete. You, perfect. You, complete. So these are both adjectives. Lacking, we already talked about, kind of a unique one, is a participle. And again, I admit I'm cheating from the Greek text there. Lacking in nothing, preposition, in nothing being a noun. So right there, you've identified all the parts of speech. Now, whether that means anything to you or not at this point is a different story, but at least you can say, okay, I've got a sense. So now when you do this, and again, I want to emphasize, you won't necessarily do this all the time. What I want you to do is to be able to start thinking like that. As I'm analyzing this passage, I'll begin to kind of look. What you're going to want to find is your main verbs. And because everything around it builds around that subject verb functionality. And so here, when we analyze a text like this, one of the things that I want you to do is, because you look, you see that we have two sentences here. Here's a sentence. All of that goes together. And then here's a sentence. You can see that from just the grammar. So you've got these two sentences. And so what we want to do is we want to start with this first sentence here, verses 2 and 3. And we want to start kind of breaking it down and saying, okay, well, what's the main thought grammatically that's being communicated? And this gets a little more, it takes us a little further down into the text, because now you say, well, how will I know? Okay, and what you want to usually do is you want to find the sentence structure, and the sentence is all built around the main clause. Remember, we talked about a clause being a subject and a predicate. An independent clause is one that can stand by itself. A dependent clause is something that's introduced usually by a conjunction or something that cannot stand by itself. So as you look at this sentence, you can see, well, it kind of breaks up here. There's a verb and a subject. So what's the main subject of the verb count? Count it all joy. And at first you might think it's it, but in reality, since it's in a command, it's an implied you. You all, count it all joy, my brothers and sisters. And then now again, when you meet. So here again, we've got another, when you meet trials of various kinds. You've got your subject being you. You've got your verb meet. You meet trials of various kinds. Then we've got for you know. Again, you with a subject, know is a verb, that you know that. Okay, so we can go here. There's another part. That the testing of your faith produces, there's your verb. So the testing of your faith, standing in the subject, the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Okay, so then we get to the end of our sentence right there. So at this point, look what we're seeing. We're seeing we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 different clauses in this sentence. Okay. If you're new to grammar, then you're looking at that. Hopefully you're seeing it because it's the subject, verbs, and how they work together. So you look at that and you go, okay, well, then which one's the main one? Well, let's work backwards. Can number 4 here, right here, that's a 4. Can that stand on its own? That the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And the answer is no, it can't stand on its own because it's introduced by this conjunction, meaning it's tied back to something else. That the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Well, it can't stand on its own. It's tied back to something. So let's go back to 3. For you know, can that stand on its own? Again, the answer to that is no, because of this conjunction for you know. And what is it that you know? You know that. Here's the content of what you know. So this is going to tie you back to this verb know, that you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So if I could come down here and say it like this, number 3 is a dependent clause. Number 4 is a dependent clause. So what about number 2, working backwards? Can number 2 stand on its own? Right here, when you meet trials. When you meet trials of various kinds, can that stand on its own? And hopefully you're seeing no, it can't, because of this adverb when. It's tying you back to something that's previously been said. So that leaves us this part right here. Number 1, can that stand on its own? You all count it all joy. And the answer to that is yes, that's your independent clause. And again, it won't work like this in every sentence, but in this case, you've got this compound, or you've got this complex sentence with this independent clause being the predominant thing. So what you're seeing here, if I could bring this down here and kind of draw this out, change colors here. What you're seeing being drawn out here is the primary thing that James is doing. He's saying you all. Who are the you? The brothers and sisters. I want you to count or consider let's put that in parentheses so we don't confuse our diagram here. Consider it joy. Okay. So you all, who are the all joy is coming here, right? So this is the predominant thing that James is really trying to get it across. This is a command. This can sound is he's telling them, consider, count it all joy. Now notice I'm not interpreting the text at this point. I'm not going really anywhere with it. I'm just kind of looking at it and saying, okay, grammatically, that's the predominant thing because of the fact that this is the independent clause. Okay. So you all consider or count it all joy, my brothers and sisters. Now, what you want to do with this part and this part and this part is you want to see, okay, then what are they tied to? Well, we already saw that this adverb when is introducing this idea right here It's modifying count. So it's telling you right here, when you meet trials, I'm not going to write all of this out, of various kinds, you should consider it all joy. And then he comes in here, and so this clause right here, clause number 2, is specifically telling you when to count it all joy. I mean that's the adverb that's being used, correct? So then we want to look at number 3 here. What is this tied to? Well, what are our options? If it's tied to something that's come before, it could either be modifying to right here, or it could be modifying this. So you have to kind of take it out on its own and say, okay, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So for you know, is that tied back to when you meet trials? You meet trials for you know, or is it count it all joy for you know? And I think that you can see here, just like to, this dependent clause is tied back to the independent clause. So we would come down here and we would say, okay, consider it all joy for, and I'll just go ahead and kind of tell you here, in many of your translations, they'll actually go ahead and tell you it's because you know, which then introduces the 4th clause that we have in this sentence, this number 4, and you can see pretty clearly that what you know is tied to, that 4th clause is tied to what you're knowing. You know that, so this one is tied here. You know that the testing of your faith, and I'm not going to keep riling on that. So that's just a little bit of a working diagram to get a sense of how this works. And then 1:4 comes in and builds on that last statement. I'm not going to draw that out here on the board just for time's sake, but you can see then verse 4 comes in here, and you could do the same thing with verse 4, kind of writing it out like that. But you can see that 1:4 is flowing right out of verses 2 and 3, because you have steadfastness here, you have steadfastness here. That the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, so let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Okay? So hopefully right there you're starting to get a sense, okay, so if I'm doing something with the grammar, and I can kind of get an idea of what all the various parts of speech, and then I can start to see how all of this works together and get a decent idea of how this is working. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop sharing this, and now you're back to seeing me. And I'm going to actually share another page here that is the passage that I just talked about in kind of a flow I call it a flow diagram, but it's kind of what you just saw from the grammar right there, right here, that this idea of here's your main clause right here. Count it all joy, or count it nothing but joy, count it pure joy when you meet. You studied that, it'd be the idea of falling into or surrounded by these various trials. Trials being this idea of something that I've asked you to spend some time defining. You is taking you back up. The you is implied because it's a command. So it's back up to you, brothers and sisters. When you meet trials of various kinds, right here we saw that this goes with this too, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. So here's verses 2 and 3 right out here. Okay, so one of the things that just becomes interesting, you say, okay, well, what do I do with all of this? What do I do with this? Well, what's the predominant thing that James is telling his audience to do? It's the command right here. So I can come in here and say, here's what James is explicitly right here in this passage telling his audience to do. In fact, I can even come in here and say, well, who's his audience? And I can come up here and go, who's who he's talking it to? The brothers and sisters, and we'll spell that out more when we get to the historical cultural context part. But this is who he's talking to, these brothers and sisters. You'll see this, by the way, this construction in some form or fashion. You'll see this repeated all the way throughout the letter. my beloved brothers and sisters, or my brothers and sisters. But he's speaking to them, and he tells them to count it all joy. So this is what it is that he's telling them to do this, to count or to consider it all joy. Now, our purpose today isn't to go into this, but I would tell you that if you did a word study of this, which is one of the things you were supposed to do in that assignment, you'll see that the idea of counting something or considering something is this idea to reckon, to think about, and to ponder at great length, to really. And so one of the things that I saw is that I think it's D. Edmund Hebert in his commentary talks about this idea. It's prolonged thinking that leads to a change. And so one of the things, I think it's him that translates it, adopt an attitude or adopt a perspective. And I'll go ahead and just kind of put that in there, even though that's not the purpose of here and this particular assignment. I think it's important to put that in there, because to adopt an attitude isn't just kind of don't worry, be happy, as the old song says. This is an idea after prolonged thinking about something, you learn to adopt a particular way of thinking, a particular mindset, a particular attitude about trials in this case. So you learn how to adopt an attitude of nothing but joy when you meet these trials of various kinds. And so when we start thinking about, okay, well, then what does this do? Since it's tied here into this passage, into this main clause, what is it doing? It's telling you when you should do what it is that James is calling his audience. So he's telling his audience, when you find you're facing trials, when you meet trials, when you fall into and are surrounded by these various trials of various kinds, then you should count it all joy, or adopt an attitude of nothing but joy. So hopefully you're seeing that this is just flowing right out of the text, right? This isn't, me making stuff up. This is just me wrestling with the text and saying, okay, this is what he tells us to do here. And this is, it flat out says when, so you can see that he's telling you the timing of when this should happen. And then we come into this one here, and we saw that this too goes with, so this whole part here, this subordinate clause is also modifying when, or it's also modifying count it or consider it all joy. For, So this right here, if you were to take some time and do a little bit of exegetical analysis, this conjunction right here is the idea, and in fact, it can even be translated this way. It's the idea of because. It's actually, this whole construction here is actually a participle in Greek, tied back to the main verb count. It's that when I talk about a participle, I said it's verbal in nature. So it's actually telling you something about the verb. It's describing the verb. And in this case, if you were to kind of look at your commentaries and open it up, they'll talk about it being a causal commentary. So then in English, we translate it because it's giving you the reason why they should count it all joy. So did you hear that? This right here is introducing the idea of the reason why you should count it all joy. And so what we have here, here's your why. Why should you adopt an attitude of nothing but joy when you fall into and are surrounded by various trials? Because he tells his audience, something. This. And again, if you were to do a lexical analysis of that word, it's not just an intellectual knowledge that he's talking about here. Is this idea of an experiential knowledge. From experience, this is something you've gone through. And in the great history of the Jewish nation, which we can talk about more when we talk about trials, they walk through these continuous times of testing. Quite oftentimes they would fail these tests, but in this case, James is saying, hey, I want you to adopt an attitude so that you will not fail, so that you'll persevere through all of this. But this as a people from experience, and what is it that that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And again, I'm going to do a little bit of exegetical skipping ahead because I've done this, but this idea right here, the testing of your faith, is this idea when you look at what it's actually doing in the text, and you interpret it, you find out that what he's getting at is this idea of a tried and true faith. Faith produces a steadfastness. This idea of remaining under. Endurance produces endurance. Okay, so before I go on here, I just want you to see this. Hopefully you're seeing it already. Right here from the text, look at that. Right here from this, just from the grammar alone, we've identified who he's talking to. We've identified what he's saying, when they should do what he's saying, and why they should do it. Right here from this. And one of the things you'll see from learning to do exegesis, where you just wrestle with the grammar and let the grammar, kind of what we talk about, let it draw the meaning. The meaning just rises to the surface right from the text itself. One of the things you'll see is that this kind of gets inside of you. Now you start to think about it. You start to kind of process it. When you find yourself going through these times of testing, what you need to do is consider it all joy, because you know that a tried and true faith produces steadfastness. And so for time's sake, I'm not going to go too much further here, but now notice what happens right here. And let steadfastness, what he's just been talking about right here, the thing that when a tried and true faith produces steadfastness or endurance. So he comes in and says, okay, let steadfastness, let endurance do its thing. Let it have its full effect. Why? So that you might be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. These words here are very similar words. Lacking in nothing is kind of the negative way of talking about these. And so this idea, this picture, is that you've got this kind of incomplete circle. But when you let steadfastness or endurance by faith have its perfect effect, the idea is that this circle then becomes complete. And there's this idea of perfection not being morally without sin, but this idea of what you do is you become whole. It's a picture of what we might use as the word maturity or growth, right? And so what happens is when you walk through these times of testing, James is telling his audience, when you go through these things and you adopt the right mindset, you know that a tried and true faith is going to come out the other side, and it's going to produce this idea of endurance or steadfastness. And when steadfastness or endurance does its thing, it's going to produce a more mature person. Okay. And so guys, hopefully you're getting a sense of what I'm getting at here. Hopefully you're seeing the value of grammar. Hopefully you get a sense to kind of just wrestle with this grammar. And so I'm going to end our session here, and hopefully just a little bit of grammatical analysis will give you kind of a sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about grammatical analysis, maybe how to go about doing it and why it's so important. So if you have any questions after watching this, shoot them my way, put them in the text or in the discussion threads, and we can talk more about it in these coming weeks. Blessings.